How's it going? Another episode of Turning Companies into Communities, and a very special guest, Rob Sadow, who I've had a long professional and a personal history with. So, Rob, how's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me. And yes, I've known you a long time. We worked together at Bain back in the day.
Yep.
You were early employee at Scoop. Now we work together on this, and so
Yeah.
it's fun.
Well, so I'll give kind of a quick backstory, and I'd love to hear kind of about your background. But basically, I was at Bain and I was working at Walmart, massive company, and I was like, I want to get experience working at a startup. And someone recommended that I hit you up, and they're like, Rob is one of the best guys I worked with. He's starting this company. It's early stage. This was in San Francisco, like maybe a decade. I mean, it was 10 years ago, I think.
Feels like 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've been doing a startup for 10 years, so
right.
So from that perspective. But when I mean, we'll talk about Scoop in a second, but one of the things that comes to mind is, first of all, I learned a lot just from working with you, but then G2VP is an investor, and I was talking to someone who worked at Bain, ended up working there, and your company ended up going through a lot of challenges, and he was like, there's a lot of macro stuff, but Rob is like one of the most best CEOs that we've had in our portfolio. And so I don't know if I've actually told you.
I don't think so. That's nice to hear.
Jake Tauscher.
I'll just say thank you to the G2VP folks.
Yeah.
That's great.
But so I think you've done a lot of cool things, and you've learned a lot and experienced a lot as a business leader and as a person. So perhaps let's just talk about what Scoop was perhaps and what it is now.
Yeah, that's a crazy story.
Yeah.
It's a
And we
crazy
can go
story. There's
quicker.
always a little scar tissue, I feel like, even as I talk about it,
Well, let's
It's
do the
like-
first part, actually. So I met you in San Francisco, 10-person startup. What were you doing?
Yeah, so I started Scoop with my brother, as you know this, right? But
Yeah.
I started Scoop with my brother in 2015. And the initial idea for Scoop came out of our experience growing up. And we grew up in Atlanta, and my high school was 25 miles away from where I lived. And so we drive 250, 300 miles a week back and forth to school. And we had this belief that you could use software and technology to deliver better experiences, and people could share trips back and forth to the office. And we built a carpooling solution for commuters to share trips, and we sold it to enterprises as a way to reduce real estate costs associated with parking and improve recruitment and retention of employees that were coming from far away, things like that. And we started it in San Francisco, and you were one of the first 10 guys, the first 10 folks that were at Scoop.
Yeah. So maybe talk about just building a company and how you scaled, what Scoop got to as you were kind of growing and kind of that journey, because several years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonably big company over
Yeah.
time, right? So we started in 2015. At our largest, I think Scoop is about 200 people, roughly.
Yeah.
Some of our customers were some of the biggest companies in the world, companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. So we anchored some pretty big commute programs for big companies around the country. And revenue scale was pretty sizable. We raised over $100 million in capital. So end of 2019, certainly felt like things were moving the right direction. We were pretty excited about 2020. That's where we were at.
Yeah. And then I guess the phrase is act of God or something. What happened in...
Yeah, act of God or force majeure, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it. But obviously everyone knows what happened in March of 2020. Commute volume effectively went to zero. All of our companies, for the most part, had employees working from home. And I don't know if you remember. Do you remember in the first months, everyone thought 3 months later people were going to be
100%.
back? It's like if you said at that time, you're like, look, I think in August, people are still going to be home. People would look at you be like, you're crazy. It was like, why are you so negative? There's no way it's going to be the case. But then it would be June, and people would be like, maybe people won't be back in 2020, the year. And be like, what are you talking about? And, and the timing kept pushing further and further, and it caused us to have to kind of majorly revisit the way we thought about what we could do as a company. And were we going to hunker down and wait for the commute come back, or do we need to look at kind of more serious alternative options? It's really, 2020 is really tough. It's a tough year for everybody. It was a very tough year for Scoop.
Yeah. And maybe let's just talk about that, right? Because I think starting a company is super hard. Not only starting a company, but working in an early stage startup is challenging. You're not only, giving your time, but a lot of times your blood, sweat, and tears, your emotions, especially particularly as a founder. How did that psychologically kind of affect you and John, who's your brother and your co-founder?
It's terrible. It is the worst thing professionally I've ever had to go through. Was the combination of watching something that you built be impacted that way, and not just the company itself, but what it does to the people, right?
Yeah.
All these team members who had spent, so much time and energy and love and care put into the company. And, one of the things that was hardest for me about it, I don't love talking about it just because it's like still very raw, but one of the things that was hardest for me about it is it is one thing as an operator, CEO, executive to mess up and have to tell the company, look, we made a mistake. We were too aggressive in hiring. We didn't allocate capital correctly. We missed goals. And as a result, we've got to make a change. And the company will be mad at you, and rightfully so, around it. But you can own it, and you at least feel responsible at the end of the day, like you knew that was part of your decision making. Totally different thing when like the company is doing well, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, we were building for a world. That world no longer exists because of a freak once in 100-year event. And so all of this energy you've put in is for a world that is different. And I'm sorry, because it's hard to reason through that. It doesn't feel fair. And I think that was a much harder message to deliver. And it's a much harder thing as a founder to kind of ingest, is when it's just kind of taken away from you in that regard.
And by the way, so we have two people, we've had two people, one of whom's still at Marco, who worked at Scoop and was affected by kind of reductions in force, right? And so I personally, we were still friends, and that must have been.
Most of our companies affected by a reduction in force. We were at 200 people, and by the time we got to 2021, we were under 40 people.
Yeah.
It's just there's no revenue coming through anymore. Business model had to change, and we could talk about how that evolved. But we tried to treat our team well. We tried to be as transparent as we could. I don't think we did it perfectly. I think we did a lot of things right, though. But it was really hard. It was a hard moment for folks, and certainly a hard moment for us as founders.
So before we get into the next phase of Scoop, kind of like and maybe this will transition into the next phase, like what are some of the lessons you learned, maybe from a personal standpoint as well as from a business standpoint, around like as you evolved to the next chapter of kind of Scoop?
In what sense? You mean like from going through all of the craziness of the pandemic experience, or how do you mean it?
So I guess how I mean it is, maybe we talk about what Scoop is now, and I think there's actually lessons you probably learned that were actually outside of the fact that your business had to change, that you probably implemented in your new business. Just even we were talking about your philosophy, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe let's actually just start. What is Scoop? Let's call it Scoop 2.0.
Yeah. So Scoop right now, what we do and kind of how it evolved is we build software for hybrid and distributed teams. And the easiest way to think about that is there is a tremendous focus now on how and where we spend our time.
Yes.
The where is the part that gets talked about constantly. Are we in the office? Are we remote? One of the problems that we found being one of the biggest problems around that early in the pandemic was people go into the office, no one else would be there. They spend the day on Zoom and ask, why'd I come in the first place? And so we build software into existing tools like Slack, Google Calendar, et cetera, to make it really easy to know who's working where, planning on working where, coordinate around that activity. And as a result, when you go into the office, you do that with confidence. When you don't go into the office, it's a good decision. We solve the where piece of hybrid. The other piece of what we do increasingly focused on is the how, which is meetings have proliferated massively since the pandemic. Hybrid employees spend about 50% of their time in average in meetings. It's more than full-time.
Is it 50%? Wow.
50%. It's more than full-time in office. It's more than fully remote. I think it's because a lot of the management practices haven't fully transitioned to asynchronous versus synchronous, and so you get lots of meetings about lots of different stuff. Microsoft, I think, found that meeting time has increased 3x since pandemic. And so how do you think about what's worth a meeting, what's not, where are people going to be for it? We built a lot of capability now around better centralization of content around meeting for hybrid meetings. And how do you reduce meetings and eliminate meetings that don't need to happen so that hybrid employees can be more productive?
Got it. So just to summarize, you have kind of two sets of products, let's say. One is like, where are people at? How do you make the most of time when you're together? And then also the how, which is like, how do you make meetings not suck?
Yeah, if I had to simplify it into one sentence, it would be, how do you enable employees to make better decisions on how and where they spend their time?
Yes. Well, that's a admirable goal, because I think all of us, honestly, like before, this is always, this should have been optimized before, but I remember, I was in San Francisco, I was working at SoftBank, and SoftBank is in San Carlos. And I would spend and this goes to, commute, but it also goes to kind of like the flexibility that remote and hybrid work provides. I spent an hour and a half in traffic. It sucked, and
It's terrible. Yeah.
So how I spent my time was under optimized. We also had an office in San Francisco that no one really used because people wanted to have FaceTime to then sit with noise canceling headphones in your office. So it's not like it was optimized before.
And look, the one of the biggest changes, and there's a lot of terrible things that happened during the pandemic, but one of the biggest silver linings is people now are much more intentional around the way they spend their time.
Yeah.
And part of that comes from fear of loss. And it's the things that I believed I was going to be able to do in the future, the vacations I wanted to be able to take, the investments I was going to do, whatever it is. All of a sudden, the pandemic taught people those things may not be available to you in the way that you thought they were before. And so as a result, things that I would just do as a routine day in, day out, and kind of like grind my clock on that and energy on it, people are like, wait, do I really want to spend my time that way?
Totally.
And as a result, the office part of that has become, instead of a default, it's now a decision. And people are weighing, well, what are the costs associated with going into the office? How much time does it take? What does that look like in terms of where I spend my time, my family, things like that, against the value that comes from the office?
Yeah.
And I think that gets lost sometimes in the return to office discussion and mandate is employees need a reason to think the office is going to be really valuable for them above and beyond just the fact that you want them to go. It's a different mindset now because of the pandemic than employees had 5-10 years ago.
Well, let's even make it personal, right? So you just had a kid, right? So how do you think about it in the context of your own personal flexibility, what you're able to do being present as a father, that sort of thing, those trade-offs?
Totally. Yeah, for me, it's a bit bipolar because in some ways it's like I would love to be out of the office because I'm like, okay, I have a 1-month-old at home and a 2-year-old at home, and it's like, okay, there are times where I'm like, I would love to escape, but in reality, like what happens most of the time is it's the little moments that you lose when you weren't at home that you're only cognizant of because you're now at home. And examples being like, I'm home for dinner every night with my kids.
Yeah.
I get to see my daughter sometimes, like if she happens to be at home and I go down for lunch or to grab a snack or something, I can say hi for 2 seconds and go back upstairs. I have hundreds, if not thousands of little memories like that, these little moments, It doesn't change my productivity level. It's not like I don't go back upstairs to my office and I work and I can be just as productive at home. I've got the right setup. But those moments, like those human family moments, are really valuable to me.
Yeah.
And you only get them at this point in life, right? Like you blink your eyes and all of a sudden your kids are in middle school and they don't want anything to do with you and they're running around.
They'll come back, don't worry.
Maybe, right? But it's a totally different world at that point in time. And that's very special for me personally. I also got a front row seat to what it means for my wife going through this. And in her ideal world and in my ideal world, like we actually like the idea of being hybrid. Like I think we like being able to go somewhere a few days a week and be home a few days a week. But when she was really pregnant and not feeling well, being remote was really, really valuable to her. And transitioning back into the workforce after Lila, my oldest, was born, and being able to rest when she needed to or pump, those kind of things, like really, really valuable to her at that point in time. And one of the things I realized was that even for the same person, what you need varies quite a bit over time.
Yeah.
It could be different this year versus next. You might have different caregiving responsibilities, health things, other things going on. And that flexibility is something that historically didn't exist, right? Like you were in the office 5 days a week, every week, didn't matter what was going on in your life outside. That causes a lot of drop in workforce participation. It's tough on different points in life. This flexibility is now accounting for that in a different way. And I don't think I truly personally understood it the same way until I had children.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can cause people to resent work, right? Because it's this barrier between, perhaps in this case, you and your family. And my sister, I guess two personal my anecdotes. My sister works as a doctor. There is less flexibility. So she ended up now taking a job in a pharmaceutical company, J&J. She has a lot more flexibility because she's got a 2-year-old kid. And that just changes her relationship with work, actually.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, there's a lot of things we could have a whole other conversation about, like kind of like societal issues in the US that make this break down. Childcare is super complicated. School usually ends at like 2 or 3 or 4, depending on like the age of your kid. People work till 6. What do you do about that, right? Like there's certain gaps in care and coverage. Flexibility helps solve for some of those things, right?
Yeah.
Like you can be around from 4 to 6 if you need to and hop back online later at night or hop back on the weekend if you want to catch up, working the same number of hours, distributed in a different fashion. All of a sudden, people continue to participate in the workforce in a way they couldn't previously. And that stuff really matters.
I mean, just another person. I remember when I was a kid, my mom I did all the after school programs, but I had to because she literally couldn't pick me up until after work. Both my parents were working. And so it's just interesting to reflect on
Yeah,
that.
totally. I mean, look, Lila's 2, and they're like, we have an after-school science thing and math thing, and we're like, yes. We're like, we'll take all of them. We'll stack as many extracurricular activities as you want to, because like it also helps fill the time for her, in terms of what she does.
Yeah. So, what is Flex Index? Because you're very data driven. I mean, there's the personal element of this, which we can talk about kind of a lot. We can continue that conversation. But then there's also a lot of amazing data that you've collected at Scoop, which is, I think, one of the differentiating things about your company. Perhaps speak a bit about.
Yeah, sure.
That.
So we talked about what Scoop does, right? And,
Yeah.
and we have software that's used on 6 continents, dozens of countries, teams all over the world use Scoop. At the same time, about, I would say maybe 12, 15 months ago now, I can't remember if I told you this, but we ran into a almost embarrassingly obvious problem, in developing software, which was we could not figure out which companies were hybrid. Couldn't tell from the outside. Like I wouldn't have known if Marco is hybrid or fully remote. Like that was not obvious. And that was really problematic because we would talk to an organization and be like, hey, this is what we do software-wise. They're like, yeah, it's great, but we're fully remote, so that's not helpful to us, or something to that effect. And we started to dig in, like, how do we figure this out? And we realized that not only was there no good way for us to figure this out, but lots of people really cared about this problem.
Yeah.
If you were a job seeker, you really wanted to know what the company you were looking at stance was on flexibility, because it influenced maybe whether it was a fit for your life. You want to apply there. Companies trying to benchmark against what their competitors are doing, make sure that someone's not going to steal talent from them because they're more flexible. The media was writing about this all the time because there's a ton of interest.
They still are.
Because every time a company changes policy, it's really interesting to people.
Yeah.
And there's like some deep kind of like psychological reasons why that's the case. The issue the media was running into was, a company like Disney, for example, changes its policy. And the media asks, well, is that indicative of where all big companies are going to go over time? Is this a one-off? There's no data set around it. And so you couldn't figure out what was trend and what was isolated anecdote, right?
Yep.
And then there's all these academics and future of work consultants and researchers who are trying to figure out where we're headed, but there was no quality data to understand what the requirements were. So we built the Flex Index, which is a global repository of company office requirements.
Yeah.
And today we track, I believe, 7,500 companies across more than 50,000 offices. Those companies employ more than 100 million people globally. And we just started scrounging together, like, what's their policy?
How do you get that, actually? Do you just ask them? Or is it self-reported? Or is it?
It was a combination of things. Very challenging. So at the very, very beginning, we built a survey. And, the Mark Twain, if I had more time, I would have written it shorter or whatever. You would, maybe you wouldn't be surprised. A lot of people would be surprised how much energy goes into getting the survey short enough that people would respond to it. So we basically figured out a way to create like a 5-question survey that I could roughly typecast your company. Do you have offices or not, right? Are people required to go to those offices? Is it a minimum number of days or specific days, right? And we could figure out roughly what it was. And so we kind of gathered the very initial list of companies with reaching out to executives and people in network and forums, et cetera, and try to get people to add companies the information with the promise that we would then display all this information for free so people could actually see what was going on. Then we started to complement it with a ton of research. And we basically have folks who are constantly looking to say, okay, has a company listed on their careers page what their specific office requirements are? Or they put it in job descriptions? Or did they do a podcast and talk about their approach? Or did Forbes write an article and reference this company's policy with a quote, right? And every time we would find that, we would add it to the Flex Index.
Yeah. And you'd source it. Would you? So
we don't necessarily source it on the Flex Index itself.
Yeah.
But it kind of in our internal tagging database, every time it's like, okay, here's an article that says this thing, and then you go add it, et cetera. And then we started reporting on it, and that's where it got really interesting. Is that when we launched it, we started to put out monthly reports, and we said, okay, what's happening in tech versus finance, or what's happening in the Bay Area versus New York, or big companies versus small companies? What are their policies? And that got a lot of interest because it started to scratch an itch for a lot of different stakeholders in terms of what was going on. And so, our research is now regularly featured in Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fortune, Bloomberg, Inc., Time, major publications all over the place. I'm pretty proud that I think we've built one of the what's viewed as kind of one of the most important data sets on policy, at least in terms of how it's evolving.
Well, two observations that I have. One is in true entrepreneurial fashion, you're like, shit, this doesn't exist. You're like, let's go build it. So that's awesome. And then secondly, I mean, just as an observation, it's like creating value for people is often an amazing go-to-market solution. Because I'm assuming people, I mean, I know this because I see, and we'll talk about social presence, LinkedIn, kind of you as a thought leader and that sort of thing. But people now go to Scoop to as a source of information, right?
That's right. And it's interesting because the Halo brand impact on Scoop is meaningful, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're probably one of the more recognizable and important brands when it comes to flexible work at this time. It's giving us information that we need over time to better think about who do we target and who could get value out of the software that we build. And I think that data ends up helping not just us, but a lot of other people, and so the thought leadership and content around that just continues to build presence. And I think it builds a kind of like a virtuous circle, if you will, around it. The other thing is that the people who are most often updating the profiles or kind of updating their information are generally the HR and real estate leaders who are thinking about the kind of stuff that we build software-wise, right? And so there is a kind of increasingly strong relationship over time between, I think, the work we do on Flex Index and how it not only feeds more broadly the understanding of what's happening in the future of work and flexible work, but also what we're trying to accomplish in software to enable it.
That's awesome. And perhaps also the data is about remote versus hybrid. What are your perspectives? And it's a nuanced topic, which I appreciate. You don't have just one view. I think you're a pretty balanced kind of individual. So it's like, what is your perspective?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's nuanced. I'll start with like the things that I believe firmly, and then things that I think are quite kind of like different, maybe company to company or industry to industry. I believe that there is no reason anymore to require corporate employees to be in the office full time.
Yeah, and you define full time as 5
days a week, or more. There's no good argument for it. There is no piece of research that says that requiring companies to be in the office full time leads to better revenue growth, better productivity, better performance in hiring or engaging talent. It deliberately keeps certain people out of the workforce, as we've talked about, right?
Yeah.
In terms of people who have caregiving responsibilities. It is not an accident that in the most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics data, women aged 25 to 54, people with disabilities, are participating in the U.S. workforce at all-time highs. Like, that is not accidental. That is related to flexibility posture. And so there is not a single good argument why you would require people to work in the office 5 days a week. Now, that doesn't mean that certain people wouldn't like to work in the office 5 days a week. That's great. If you want to do that, do you. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any good reason to require full-time in office work anymore for corporate employees. Once you get past that, I think it starts to become more nebulous. I think that it varies quite a bit by industry. Example being industries that proximity to customer physically are really important, naturally lend themselves to more office time, and that makes sense, right?
As an example, just
hospitality, retail, consumer goods, right? Like when we were at Bain together, one of the clients I worked with was a big retailer, and their headquarter, kind of like executive offices, were on one of the top floor above one of their flagship stores.
Yep.
And it became a thing, at least at that point in time, that when an executive was trying to think through a thorny problem, maybe something complicated, et cetera, they would go down, just walk the floor, see what the customers were doing, how they were interacting, right? That's unique to retail as a way of solving a problem. In tech, I can't just go and walk out and see how people are engaging with my software, right? That doesn't really work in same capacity.
Yeah, we talked to Sweetgreen, and they're like, we want people to be actually not in the stores, actually.
That's
we
right.
want to see how people are making salads.
Exactly, right? That's important, right? And so, there are obvious differences between industry, for example.
Yeah.
Also, different roles are really different. What a salesperson versus an accountant versus engineer needs to do in terms of where they should work, what is the best enabling environment, what kind of collaboration they do internally versus externally, also leads to different like potential balances in terms of what makes sense, in terms of hybrid and kind of what flexibility.
Yep.
That also can vary a lot based on personality. So am I more extroverted or introverted? Do I need a lot of quiet in order to work, or sound, right? Like, do I find that I get energy around being around people or not? You know, like all of these different things can influence what's right. As a result, I think the best practice that's starting to evolve is what I would describe as team level agreements, which is company may set rough guardrails around what they would like. Either it's employees' choice, so employees choose how often, or they say maybe we want people in 2 days a week because we believe that creates enough space for collaboration. But teams then customize that and say, okay, is that 2 days a week anybody chooses? Or for our team, is it Tuesday, Wednesday? Or how do we think about that from a working hours perspective? So you can take those individual perspectives and kind of like get to the right answer for a team, and preserve flexibility while still creating the right balance of in-person and virtual that maybe the company is designing for in terms of collaboration and relationship building and affiliation with culture and things like that.
Got it. I think just a product idea, it'd be interesting because I think that the way you frame it is very rational and like trade-offs, right? You're articulating those. And I think we hear a lot of headlines, which is like a finance firm says everyone's going back without any context as to the trade-offs, or vice versa. And you have people who are shouting from the rooftop saying you have to do remote, and that's literally the only thing they're saying, and they're not advocating for the downsides or the upsides. And I think to your point, it's complicated.
It's complicated, and look, zealotry helps nobody. You know, in some ways, I often liken the debates around flexible work to primaries in the U.S., where you've got.
I'm just getting depressed even here.
I know, it's a little sad, right? Especially as we like approach 2024.
Yeah.
But it's like there is a group of executives that believe so strongly in full-time in office, and it's because they grew up in an environment that was full-time in office. It's the way that made them successful. It's the way that they imagined the company was made successful over time. It's not data-driven. It's more emotional,
yes,
experientially driven. And they shout from the rooftops about how we have to work full-time in office and people who don't are lazy, et cetera. And that's one side that kind of like likes to bang the drum.
Yep.
And then on the other side, you have people who are like, I do not understand why anyone of any person would ever want to be in an office. Fully remote is the only way to go. Every company is going to be fully remote in the future. Everything should be kind of like done asynchronously. And that is another kind of zealotry that exists on the other side, right? The vast majority of companies and employees believe the answer is hybrid. They're going to spend part of your time in the office and part of the time out. There are different points of view, as we've talked about, in terms of how much flexibility should be given to employees within that paradigm. But that's kind of where we're at. But like the shouting on the sides doesn't help anybody in that regard. And it dominates a lot of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be a product that allows a leader or a team to choose based on variables and articulate, oh, these are the trade-offs. This is how you set parameters. Because I think oftentimes there isn't a framework that people are using to even set those. They just set them.
Totally. But part of it is that this is an adoption cycle, you know? And I think people forget that because the whole world had to go remote effectively when the pandemic hit. When I say the whole world, I mean corporate employees, right? Like there's still a lot of people on the front lines that were not remote during that time period. Look, in normal cycles, you have early adopters and you've got laggards, and things take years, if not decades, to play out, right? Like that's how cycles work.
Correct.
We are 3.5 years into the concept of hybrid work as it exists today.
Yeah.
And really, we're not even 3.5 years into it because at the beginning, everybody was home.
Figuring it out.
So really, like maybe we're more like a couple of years. And so there's no early adopter set that's been doing this for decades and has best practices that everyone can learn from. We just wrote a report on this, but I think the closest group to that is actually professional services, right? If you're a consultant, you get really used to not being co-located. You spend some time in the office and sometimes at the client, and sometimes you're elsewhere, right? Like those types of companies are probably best at what it means to operate across location. And as a result, they're much higher adopters of flexibility, by the way. But not many companies have figured that out yet. And so it's going to take a bunch of years, you know, to still kind of like zero in on what that should be. And people forget about that because the pandemic was like such a stark moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the professional services. I would be at Bain, and this is anything against Bain, but any professional services, and be at a client site in a room where I didn't interact with anyone but my team, heads down on my laptop in a very uncomfortable position. And so maybe those are even within the client site you can.
Well, think about the variance of that, right? Like some projects or like some cases, right? When we were at Bain, 4 days a week on site in a room with no windows in your team at the client site, right? Especially if it's like sticky M&A or kind of like a closed room type of situations. Sometimes, and this is by virtue of the fact that the teams reshuffle all the time, you're in the office, you can't see anybody else on their team because they might be in a different office or on a different floor, et cetera. Part of your team is at the client, part of the team is at the office because of whatever meetings are happening that day. And you might go days without seeing a team member for more than an hour or something like that, right? And so consultants are really used to that variability, kind of like mixes in and out. But prior to the pandemic, in a lot of industries, people were co-located most of the time, right? Even though that was already starting to shift because of distributed work and increasingly globalized work, but professional services firms are a little ahead on that curve.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your podcast and the types of folks that you're kind of chatting with, of whom I was listening to a couple of very impressive folks.
Yeah. So we have a podcast. It's called Flex Perspectives.
Check it out.
Yeah, please check it out. It's a good one. I interview operators, future of work thinkers, academics, journalists sometimes about different future of work topics. It can vary from, let's spotlight a particular company and how they're approaching flexible work and what they've learned along the way. It could be a piece of academic research. So we were with Professor Raj Chowdhury at HBS, who did some really interesting stuff on offsites and the relationship.
Which is particularly interesting for us.
Which I imagine is interesting. And did that. So we do that, and it's a podcast that runs bi-weekly. It's another angle on kind of like the flexible work content that we put out, aside from the reports on Flex Index and some of our other stuff.
And what are some of the most salient kind of insights, perhaps? I mean, there's many of them, but just like maybe perhaps name a few that have come out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had a bunch of different guests who've had really interesting things to talk about. Julia Hobsbawm on, who does something called the Nowhere Office, which is a kind of like a think tank and podcast, and also writes for Bloomberg. And she was talking about how like the Queenager generation, which are the people who grew up in the workforce in the 80s, in some ways has like the women who grew up in the workforce in the 80s have some kind of in a way like set the stage in the direction of flexibility of where we're going today, and have really voted with their feet as executives in favor of flexible things, and in some ways act as coaching for this generation, which was a really interesting conversation. I talked to Hunter Walk, who's a good friend, venture capitalist, about his perspectives on startup formation and the importance of co-location. Talked to Brian Elliott, who founder of Future Forum, who used to be SVP at Slack, about what they've learned about asynchronous work over time and team level agreements and some of that stuff. And so we've covered a lot of good ground with some folks that I really respect and have good points of view.
Well, I think some of the takeaways for me is just broadly, thematically, smart people have new perspectives on this. And if you're really looking at what you're saying, at kind of a disruption, it's like there are going to be new companies, right? There are going to be new ways of working. There's going to be upsides and downsides that you have to evaluate, gather data on, all these types of things. So I think super fascinating. I think one topic, and then we can close it out, is like, what's your view? One of the reasons this is bringing up is like huge macro implications to commercial real estate, right? Which is super, felt in San Francisco, in New York, really in any city. What are perhaps some of the things you're seeing from a commercial real estate perspective?
Yeah, it's going to be massive. Yeah. I think it's massive. And I think even most commercial real estate folks now understand that it's going to be massive. I'll give a little bit of data as to why, and then we'll talk about some of the implications of it. The three data sets that I probably rely on the most when it comes to flexible work is, one, our Flex Index policy data and how that's trending over time. Two, Nick Bloom, professor at Stanford, who's been a guest on Flex Perspectives, we collaborate a lot on reports, puts together something with other academics called WFHresearch.com. They have really good data on how many days a week do employees want to be in the office, and how many days a week are employers wanting people to be in the office on average. And they do a sample of thousands of surveys each month to get a sense of that. The third is Castle, which has the badging system, right, and security system, does what called their kind of return to office barometer. We had just interviewed the CEO of Castle the other day for a podcast. Wow. It was really interesting. And that tracks where are all of the Castle buildings. I think there are like thousands of these buildings. What are occupancy in those buildings relative to what it was pre-pandemic? So it's like a percentage basis. Our data finds that the average company that requires time in office requires about 2.6 days a week. So So think about it as like half the time in the office, half the time out. It's pretty steady year to date. Like I think it's moved from like 2.5.
And we're sitting here end of October. So.
Yeah, right. and it's like that. So we're 10 months in, right? 2.5 days a week. Nick's data from WFHresearch.com shows that employees want it to be like 2.2 days a week in the office, and employers want it to be like 2.8 days a week in the office. So policy already sits in the middle, effectively, of what employers want. It's shaded a little bit toward employer. As a result, we're kind of at equilibrium, and that's what's showing up in the Castle data, which was at the beginning of the year in January, we were at 50% occupancy relative to pre-pandemic. This week's Castle report, 50% occupancy pre-pandemic. And so we are where we are. The implication of that is profound, right? If people are using real estate effectively half the amount that they were prior, and even pre-pandemic, people were not in the office all the time. It wasn't fully utilized, right? There are really major implications for that. One, people forget that the average lease in the US, at least, historically for larger companies, like 10 plus years.
I was about to say 10 years, right? Long-term leases.
Right. So as we talked about, we're 3.5 years into the pandemic. What does that mean? It means only a third of the leases have turned over that were signed pre-pandemic.
Wow.
Every time one of those leases turns over, people reevaluate how much space they need. But
generally down is
going to be what's going to happen most. You're going to have a lot of shrinking space. It's also going to enable companies to revisit their flexibility policy when they no longer feel like they're trying to fill an office because they don't want it to feel empty for people going into the office. So that's one impact. The second is because there is such a decrease in demand for office space based on what we talked about, it's leading to a tremendous flight to quality. If I'm going to get office space, I want Class A office space because I want it to be a destination and people are going to want to go.
Interesting.
Class B, Class C stuff is getting killed, and it's going to trade. I think right now it trades at like 30 cents on the dollar.
So I want smaller, better.
I want smaller. I want better. I don't want old and stodgy and larger, right? And so a lot of that stuff is going to be effectively worthless over time, and the profound implication of that is for downtowns, especially in dense urban areas. You talked about San Francisco, which is at like 30+% vacancy rate.
Wow.
New York is obviously very impacted by this. And so cities are starting to think about what does it mean for their tax base, because a lot of the tax comes from real estate taxes. It impacts retail. If no one's in the office on Fridays or in Mondays, like what does that do in terms of like retailers and their ability to survive in those areas? There's a lot of thought around investments in tax, kind of like, I guess the right word would be like not havens, but kind of like tax schemes or incentives to support developers in changing the property from office to residential. Oh, that's really complicated.
There was just a great article in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal has done some great stuff on this. New York Times has too, but it's like it's super complicated, especially relative to building code. They're not built with like one bathroom per unit, so there's not the plumbing that's kind
of
like...
There's like a Twitter meme of like this like office building with these pillars, and it's like an apartment. And you're like, what the heck?
Yeah, it's great. You cut windows because like you don't have these floors. Like, what do you do with the internal? Like, if it's a city block, what happens to the internal units? Yeah. Right, like. It starts to feel like a war room from like a Bain case, right? You know, it's like what do you do about those rooms? And so it's complicated. I think if I had to simplify it down, cities are going to have to rethink the kind of like the way that they're built in practice. Service provision, residential versus commercial. Scoop as a commute solution was predicated on the idea that most people lived in residential areas and commuted to kind of like their work areas. That stuff's going to die slowly. It's going to be much more mixed together. People are going to live closer to where they work and be more spread out in that regard too. And we're only beginning to see the effects of that. It's going to compound into 2024, 25, 26 as some of that those lease renewals come up.
Yeah, well, scary, but also exciting time to build, I guess.
Crazy. If it were not for AI and the conversation around AI, everyone would be talking about this as being like the most important disruptive kind of like trend.
Huge. Commercial real estate. Yeah. I mean, what's the magnitude of the commercial real estate?
I mean, you're talking about, I interviewed a professor at NYU who has a really smart perspective on this, Arpit Gupta, and he's like, notionally the scale of the impact here is like several $100 billion to $1 trillion in the United States in terms of like asset value. It's huge.
Yeah. Okay, so round us out so you can get back to your family and your day job. Perhaps let's end on a positive kind of optimistic note. I think that what I've heard here is the way communities are built is going to change. The way cities are built even is going to change. What are you kind of optimistic for with regards to the future of work?
Yeah, I think it's really healthy to be intentional around the balance of work and life.
Yeah,
I think it's causing people to do that in a way that's really smart. I think that People will be more ingrained in their family lives as a result. They'll find better balance and fluidity there. One thing I think is really important to note also, and maybe as a plug for Marco, right? I don't think that being around other human beings is less important than it was pre-pandemic.
Certainly.
In fact, you could argue that being around other human beings is more important.
It happens less frequently.
Totally. And there's a lot that's been written about epidemic of loneliness and the impact of that. And so I also think this will lead to companies and teams being much more intentional around how they get together.
Yeah.
And investment in offsite, what it means to get together for the right purposes in the right places so you can build those relationships and maintain that even when you're working remotely. And I think that kind of intentional behavior is really, really healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I think on Marco, we say we bring people together through intentional experiences. And it's not just the event in the hotel. It's literally the content and the format. Are you embodying your missions? Are you connecting the right people who might not connect on Slack? And does that lead to higher engagement and all this kind of stuff? So with that, that was a great conversation. I'm going to go back and take notes on this. So, super thankful for you to come out here and share with us some great perspectives.
That's my pleasure. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.